Apologies for the delay. Good evening, everyone. Sorry about that. Just ran a little late. So I wanted to use this opportunity to relook at something that we've looked at before, but from a different angle. To relook at the issue of Miriam's sin, Miriam's chet. At the end of this week's Sedra is a famous incident in which she engages in conversation with Aaron and says something about Moshe and is punished with saras as a result. Now, on previous occasions, exactly what this was that she said about Moshe. The pasuk says it's al oidos ha'isha hakushis. It's regarding or about or against the Cushite woman. And even though, based on Rashi, we assume that this Cushite woman is Zipporah and that they are leaping to her defense, they're upset with Moshe for separating from her, and they see it as a sign that Moshe considers it appropriate for him not to live a normal life, a normal marital life, a normal family life, and they criticize him for doing this isn't the way to live. Why has he done that? We explored in previous years, and I think the recordings are probably online. A variety of other explanations. The pasuk doesn't make clear exactly what they said. First of all, the identity of the Cushite woman, Isha Kushis, with Zipporah is not clear cut at all. Zipporah is not a Cushite woman; she doesn't come from Cush. Who is she? She's a daughter of Yisro, and therefore comes from Moav. So that's the first. Sorry. From Midian, I'm sorry, therefore comes from Midian. She's a Midianite woman. And that's the Megillas Rus in my mind. And therefore, the identity of Zipporah with the Cushite woman is not clear-cut at all. Secondly, whether they are leaping to the defense of, there should be another handout sheet or not. Okay. Whether they are leaping to the defense of Zipporah, or on the contrary, criticizing this Cushite woman, also isn't entirely clear. It may be that their objection is to Moshe being married to this Cushite woman, whether that's Zipporah or someone else. And as I said in previous years, and I think the recording is available online, for those who watch later on YouTube, I'll put the link up for if it is online, I'll put a link up for that. We've discussed that at length in previous years. What I want to look at this year is the consequence of this Lashon HaRa and Hashem's response in particular, because Hashem's response to Miriam is a very, very important source as to the nature of Moshe's Nevuah, Moshe's prophecy, and how Moshe differs from other prophets. So if we go, for example, with Rashi's explanation that they are criticizing Moshe for separating himself from his wife, and they say, look, we are also Nevi'im, we're also prophets. So why is Moshe behaving this way when we're not behaving this way? We're prophets, and yet we live a normal life. Why is Moshe behaving in this abnormal manner? Then Hashem's response is, no, Moshe is not a regular prophet. He's a radically different sort of prophet. How dare you compare yourself? If their Lashon HaRa, if their criticism of Miriam, there should be a handout somewhere, I think, I hope. Yeah. Okay. If their criticism of Miriam is, maybe I didn't print enough handouts, I don't know. Okay. If their criticism of Miriam is that, if their criticism, of Moshe is something different, then somehow other Hashem's response is still an appropriate generic response, in which he says, how dare you criticize Moshe? Don't you realize he's very different to you? He's a completely different league individual, a completely different league prophet to the rest of you. For those online, I'll just post the link again to the handout because a few more people have joined. If you haven't yet done so, you can just click on the link and see the handout. Okay, so what we're going to try and understand is rather than focusing, as we have done in previous years, on exactly what Miriam said about Moshe and the Cushite woman, we're simply going to recognize that he said something negative about Moshe, some form of Lashon HaRa, and somehow inherent in that Lashon HaRa was an equation between themselves and others. And we're going to look at how Hashem responds and how he explains the difference between Moshe's prophecy and other prophecies. And we will then see that this distinction is an important one. In fact, it's one of the Yud Gimmel Ikrim. In other words, the Rambam paskens this distinction and says that this is one of the 13 principles of faith to understand that Moshe's Nevuah is different to that of other prophets. So this is one of, if not the primary source for the superiority of Moshe over other Nevi'im. Now, we'll look later at the Rambam, depending on how much time we have available, in either greater or lesser depth. But we often blur in our mind what, according to the Rambam, is 3 different principles of faith. So there are 3 principles of faith out of the 13, which have some degree of overlap. The first is a principle of faith in the concept of Nevuah, of prophecy. In other words, the idea that Hashem communicates with human beings and says things of which we can become aware. In other words, without this principle of faith, we could believe in other Ikrei HANDOUT, the other principles. We could believe that Hashem created the universe, that he runs the world and does miracles and the like, but maybe we have no access to his thinking. Maybe we have no access to knowing him revealing anything about himself to us through communication. Maybe we can merely observe his actions and marvel at them and stand in awe of them. Maybe there's no possibility of Hashem giving us instruction. So that's the first Ikka of these 3, Ikka number 5, which is the concept of Nevuah, of prophecy. Ikka number 6, the 6th principle that the Rambam says, I'm sorry, I've gone out of order. The 6th principle is that of prophecy. The 7th principle that the Rambam says, and this is printed on page 2, is that of the prophecy of Moshe, that Moshe's Nevuah is unique, and we'll look at that in more detail shortly. Now I'm just giving the headlines. And the third of these 3 principles, Ikka number 8, principle number 8, is the uniqueness of Torah. In other words, besides the uniqueness of Moshe's prophecy, that he was superior to all other prophets, and we'll look soon in what way, Torah is a different sort of work than any of the other Torah works that there are in existence. The Torah of Moshe is different to other works of Torah. What other works of Torah do we have? Well, we have Nevi'im and Kesuvim, and we have Torah Sheba'al Peh, eventually written down, Mishnah and Gemara and Medrash and the like. None of these have the status of Torah. Torah is unique in that it was dictated to Moshe word for word. Torah is unique in that it's the only source, ultimately, of halachas. Everything has to come from Sinai. The Nevi'im and Kesuvim can't contradict Torah. They can't permanently negate Torah. Torah will never be changed. It won't be altered. So these are the Ikrim that sort of focus on the uniqueness of Torah. So in a sense, there are 3 different things. There's the general concept of prophecy, the uniqueness of Moshe's prophecy, and the uniqueness of Torah as a work, as a book that has unique halachic status. And the Rambam distinguishes between these 3. And the primary source for the middle one, for the uniqueness of the prophecy of Moshe, is this episode over here, where Hashem turns to Miriam and says, whoa, 1 minute, how can you compare yourself to Moshe in Rashi's reading, or how can you judge Moshe in the alternative reading, depending on how we understand exactly what they're saying, what exactly their Lashon HaRa is. Moshe is radically different to regular prophets. So let's have a look with that introduction in mind. So that's the plan of what we're going to look at. What Miriam, we're not going to focus on exactly what Miriam said, but the brush stroke is the Lashon HaRa of Moshe, Hashem's response, which we'll look at, the uniqueness of Moshe's prophecy, and then we're going to try and step back and understand, so what is going on, what is Miriam doing over here, and what's really happening. So let's have a quick look at page 1, and we'll just whiz through the psukim. Vaytadaber Miriam v'Aaron b'Moshe. Miriam and Aaron spoke, we'll translate it as against Moshe. The story is not that clear cut. Again, we read the story through the eyes of Rashi, and in previous years we've explored the story through the light of other Rishonim. But for now, we'll keep more or less in Rashi's reading. So Miriam spoke. Miriam and Aaron spoke about Moshe. Al odes ha'isha ha'kushis, concerning or against or regarding the Cushite woman Asher Lokach. Cushis Lokach, because he had indeed taken a Cushite woman. Rashi tells us for Tzadaber, I put Rashi in italics in English, she spoke. Whenever dibur is used, it means a harsh language, loshen kasha. So we know that she spoke, this is a harshness against Moshe. It's not just a schmooze about, speaking about the Isha Kushas. We could have read the pasuk, and they're speaking about Moshe's new wife, because they said what a wonderful woman she is. We're so happy that Moshe's found such a great wife. But Tzadaber means something harsh. The second comment Rashi makes is, but Tzadaber Miriam v'Aaron, there's a grammatical problem here in the sentence. It says Miriam and Aaron spoke, in which case it should have been in the plural, but that's not how it begins. It says Vatadaber Miriam Aaron, and she spoke, or Miriam and Aaron spoke in the singular. So Rashi says from this that he pascha b'dibur tchila, she was the one who initiated the conversation, and that's why even though Moshe and Aaron are later rebuked, it's Miriam who gets the punishment of tsaras. Okay. Pasuk Beis Vayomer Harak Ach Moshe Dib Hashem Halo Gam Banu Dibber. Does Hashem only speak to us? To Moshe, he also spoke to us. In other words, in what way does Moshe think he should be behaving in an exceptional and unusual manner? We are also prophets and prophetesses. We are also Nevi'im. Therefore, what's unique about Moshe? Pasuk Gimmel Va'ish Moshe Anov Moed Mikol Adam. Moshe is uniquely humble, which either means that because of his modesty, Aaron and Miriam didn't realize how unique he was, or his modesty equipped him for a higher level of Nevuah than regular prophets. Pasuk Dalad, Vayomer Hashem Pisom al Moshe vel Aaron vel Miriam. Hashem appears to Moshe and Aaron suddenly. Pasuk Hey, Vayoret Hashem ba'on to Onon. Hashem descends in a cloud. Pasuk Vov, Vayomer Shimon lo Zavarai. This is the crucial pasuk now. Pasuk 6. He said, "Please listen to my words," says Hashem, or now listen to my words. Im yeh nevi'achem, Hashem, if there is a prophet amongst you, Hashem b'mara elov esvada, Hashem will appear to them in a vision. B'chalom adabebo, in a dream I will speak to this prophet. Lo kein avdi Moshe, pasuk 7. Not so my servant Moshe, ki b'chol beiti ne'emanhu, because he is faithful throughout my house. Per el per adabebo, I speak to him mouth to mouth, or mare velo richitos, in a vision and not in riddles. Utzmunas Hashem yabit, he beholds the image of the Lord. Or madur lo yiresim adaber b'avdi Moshe, why did you not fear to speak against my servant Moshe? And then the pasuk carries on that Miriam gets tsaras, leprosy, as a punishment for her sin. Pasuk 10, if we go all the way down to the bottom of the page, Va'onon sar me al ha'el, the cloud departed from the tent, and under the presence of Hashem left. So Miriam tsaras, Kasharek, Miriam is afflicted with tsaras as white as snow, and Miriam is confined outside the camp. Pasuk 15, as per the instructions of Tazria Matzorah, instructions on how we treat a leper. Okay, so these are the critical psukim. Now let's jump to source 4 on page 2. And basically the Rambam is going to analyze these psukim. In fact, maybe we can do so. If we go back, maybe we jump too fast. If we go back to page 1 and we look at the critical psukim, Hashem says a number of things about the difference. Pasuk 6, 7, and 8 are the critical psukim, and they describe the difference between regular prophets and Moshe. A regular prophet only gets to see Hashem in a vision and to speak in a dream. Moshe is faithful, ne'emon, throughout my house, whatever exactly that means. And finally, pasuk 8, with Moshe, it's per, mouth to mouth. It's a vision and not in riddles. He sees the image of Hashem. So there's a number of distinctions drawn between Moshe and regular prophets. Okay, let's turn to page 2 and have a look at the Ikrim. So in the 6th principle, the Rambam says that a prophecy, belief in prophecy is an Ikr, is a principle of faith. Interestingly, I don't want to go into this in too much detail now. Possibly we've spoken about it in the Sunday morning on philosophy. If not, it's probably a topic that we should cover. The Rambam believes that prophecy, it's not enough to achieve prophecy to be a tzaddik, a righteous person, and a very spiritual person. A person has to have an intellect that can grasp the insights of prophecy. And almost the vision of the Rambam, we'll come back to this metaphor later, is almost as if we live in a world in which there's constantly a spiritual broadcast, and we have to sort of tune ourselves to receive it. So as we sit here in this room, there's the world the air is full of constant communication. There's radio waves, electromagnetic radiation whizzing through the air. If we have equipment tuned in to receive it, whether it's a television receiver, or a radio, or a mobile phone, well, then we can hear some of those signals. So the Rambam's almost image is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is constantly broadcasting insight and messages and revelation, and Nevi'im have attuned themselves to picking up this this broadcast, as it were, and they've done so through exercises of their minds. So it's a broader discussion how, if we want to label it, Chovas Halavavos, the work of the heart, and work of action interacts with work on our minds. We humans are intellectual beings, we're emotional beings, we're physical beings. But in the Rambam's thinking, famously, a very significant part of this is how we mold our minds into becoming a certain sort of thinker. And if we go through and keep Torah mitzvahs in the right manner, and we use it in the way that it's fully intended, it molds us into becoming, amongst other things, receivers that are able to hear the voice of Hashem in the world, and that's what it means to be a prophet. This is the Rambam in source 4. In source 5, he talks about the uniqueness of Moshe, and he says really two things. The second thing he says is that on a practical level, there are 4 differences between the prophecy of Moshe and the prophecy of everyone else. And I've printed this in the Hebrew and the English. I should say, by the way, that source 5 comes from the commentary of the Rambam on Mishnayos. The Rambam wrote at a young age, at 30, he wrote a commentary on the whole of Mishnayos. By and large, Mishnah is about halachic matters, but there are sections of Mishnah that deal with matters of Musa and matters of philosophy. The section of Mishnah that deals with Musa, character development and the like, is of course Pirkei Avos, and the 10th or 11th, depending how you order it, chapter of Sanhedrin deals with philosophical matters. It deals with Omar Bar and the like. And the Rambam used that opportunity in his Perush Mishnayos to teach us about the 13 principles of faith. So he wrote about that in his Perush Mishnayos. Much later in life, he then wrote his great halachic work, the Mishnah Torah, and there, in somewhat similar form, he also wrote these principles of faith, and that's in a sense the more significant work because that's his actual halachic work. The other advantage of his Mishnah Torah is it's written in Hebrew, in Lashon HaKodesh, whereas his commentary Mishnayos is written in Arabic, and we only have well, you can access, we do have the original Arabic, but it's a classic Arabic, very difficult to understand, and those of us who don't speak classic Arabic can only access his work in translation, and therefore both the Hebrew and the English here are equally second-hand sources. They are both translations of his commentary on the Mishnayos. If you look in his Mishnah Torah, in his halachic work, you can see fairly similar. Source that goes through this. For those who are interested, this is in Hilchos Yesodei HaTorah, the principles of Torah, Perek Zayin, chapter 7. He says a parallel thing. I just use this source because it was a little bit simpler. But basically, the Rambam says 2 points. The second point he says is that there are 4 differences between the Nevuah of Moshe and everyone else. And the first point he makes is that this is because of the uniqueness of Moshe's personality. And I'll explain that in a few moments. But first of all, just to go through the differences between Moshe's prophecy and a regular prophecy. He says the first is that every prophet is spoken to via an intermediary, and only Moshe speaks directly to Hashem. The Rambam reads this into the pasuk that we just read. So we're jumping a little bit backwards and forwards, for which I apologize. If we go back to our original pasuk, Hashem says about Moshe in pasuk 8, I speak with him mouth to mouth, and he beholds an image of Hashem, the Lord. He involves Sumunas Hashem Yabit. He sees Hashem himself. The Rambam understands that to mean that everyone else only gets prophecy through a malach. Now, if you learn Tanakh, sometimes this is explicit and sometimes not. So, for example, last week, the Haftarah of Shimshon, it was very clear Malach appears to Manoach and his wife to tell them about Shimshon. The Akedah, a Malach calls down to them from the heavens. Hagar, a Malach appears to her and says, go back to your master, your husband, Avram, and so on and so forth. So sometimes it's explicit. Other times, the pasuk describes a revelation from Hashem to a prophet. The Rambam understands that to mean Hashem through the intermediary of a malach, an angel. Again, exactly what a malach is a complicated matter. This I did discuss in my Sunday morning series, I think. But a malach is some form of messenger or spiritual revelation rather than direct contact with Hashem. Yeah. The Rambam understands in all those cases it to mean only through a malach. it's not a direct revelation of Hashem. Many other Rishonim disagree with this view, and they don't think this is a difference between Moshe and everyone else. But this is the view of the Rambam here in Perish Mishnayos. That's what the Rambam says. Again, just so you're with me, this is on page 2, the 7th principle of faith. About a third of the way up from the bottom, it says the first one. The Rambam, I put it in bold. Look at the English. There's actually no reason for us to look at the Hebrew here for now because they're both translations. The first one is that any prophet that existed was only spoken to by Hashem through an intermediary, whereas Moshe is spoken to directly. Okay. The second one, the Rambam says, also by the way controversial, is that Hashem only appeared to a prophet when they were asleep. And the Rambam has an explanation as to why this is. But again, he translates this into our psukim, in which he understands that our pasuk has said is in a way this is what Hashem is sort of saying to Moshe when he says, "I speak to him pair, mouth to mouth." In other words, Moshe is able to communicate back. He's not in a sleep or a trance-like state. Now, the third difference the Rambam says is that whenever any other prophet has a nevuah, their physical powers weaken, they shrink in on themselves, and they experience a great fear. In other words, they experience the prophecy as overwhelming, as opposed to Moshe, who doesn't feel overwhelmed through the prophecy. And I want to put these two differences together and understand why there's this difference and how the Rambam understands it. So the Rambam explains that any prophecy comes about through an intellectual, as I said, an attunement to the words of Hashem. Now, why are we, us here in the room, unless anyone here is a Novi, why are we not picking up that broadcast? The answer is because we don't live in a sufficiently spiritual dimension. We, by and large, inhabit our physical bodies, and we see the world through the physical eyes, and we experience the world through the lens of largely and significantly appetite and greed and laziness and power and desires and physical wants and so on and so forth. And it is through that means that we experience life. Now, I don't mean chas v'shalom to say that we're greedy, selfish, lazy people. I simply mean that we're grappling with that. We need to recognize that that's what it means to be a human. That there is within us always lurking a hidden animalistic force, and we make choices, hopefully, and a lot of the time succeed in not allowing anger or power or greed or laziness or whatever selfishness to overwhelm us. But we live in a world in which this is the medium to which we operate is very physical. A prophet is someone who, at least momentarily, can rise above that and has a clarity of purpose and vision that allows them to inhabit a world of spiritual clarity. And this is what the Rambam meant when he wrote about the receptors being attuned to hearing the world of the divine. However, even prophets can only do so when they negate their physical bodily powers. Hence, the Rambam says they fall asleep, they fall into a faint-like experience, such that they lose their physical faculties, they cease to see and hear and act. And at that point, they can experience prophecy. So again, we don't know that much about how prophets prepared themselves for prophecy. The Rambam in his commentary on the Mishnayos speaks about prophets preparing themselves for prophecy, and in a minute we'll see the fourth difference between Moshe and others in this respect. We know that there were schools of prophets, right? We have the stories with, in Nach many times, schools of prophets are referenced. We have some tantalizing glimpses of the sort of mystical and meditative exercises they needed to engage in order to receive prophecy. But part of what they had to do was dull their physical senses, because their physical sense would block the ability to hear spiritual insight. And when they do get and hear the voice of spirituality, they experience that as overwhelming. It's frightening. It's awesome. The mode of yira, as opposed to the mode of ava is love. Ava is a longing desire to connect. Yira is a sense of fragility, fear. We feel fearful when we sense how fragile we are. A prophet can only experience the divine, or when they do experience the divine, they feel it threatening their existence, because they still identify partly as physical beings. Moshe Rabbeinu, in contrast, has ceased to identify as a physical being. The Rambam is of the view that in some respects, Moshe Rabbeinu is almost like a malach. The Rambam is of the view that in some respects, Moshe has negated any physicality about himself. And therefore, Moshe can experience prophecy even when he is awake, and he can experience it without the dulling of his physical and bodily sensations, and he can experience it without a sense of fear because Moshe is completely comfortable with himself as a spiritual being. In fact, this is really the answer to the question of why Moshe ceases regular family life and none of the other prophets do. Because all the other prophets are physical beings who inhabit physical bodies and need to continue living within a physical dimension. Moshe, who has risen above physicality and become almost angelic in life, is therefore able to experience spirituality on the highest level, but therefore has to step back from regular physical life. The Rambam, by the way, sometimes refers to Moshe with an Arabic term called the shliach. He calls him the messenger. Now, I don't know how exactly the Arabic word, I have to comment on that, other than what's the literal translation of malach? A messenger. Yaakov sent messengers, right? So malach just means a messenger. In other words, whatever an angel is exactly, an angel is a messenger of Hashem. That's its defining feature. By the way, the Rambam quotes, and it's a pasuk, Oise malachov ruchos. Hashem makes the winds his angels. In other words, in one respect, you can say that the weather is an angel of Hashem, is a malach of Hashem. The force of gravity is a malach of Hashem. Because the laws of nature and science are also messengers of Hashem, as the Rambam points out. But in this context, Moshe is malach-like, and he is the unique individual to whom the regular rules, therefore, of engaging in physical experiences don't apply, because he has risen above physicality. He doesn't see the world as primarily as we see the world as physical beings, and then need to exercise self-control and spiritual discipline and focus in order to make appropriate and right choices. Moshe sees the world through the eyes of a spiritual being. Therefore, his prophecy doesn't involve the negation of bodily functions, doesn't involve the negation of his need to fall asleep. He doesn't need to dull himself in any way. He doesn't experience it as a fearsome experience. And this is really Hashem's response to Aaron and Miriam when he speaks to them. The final difference the Rambam says, and this is now the top of page 3, is the fourth difference he says is that this is in the middle already of page 3. He says any other prophet only sporadically experiences prophecy, and Moshe lives in a permanent state of prophecy. And this is really a continuation of the same idea that other prophets need to elevate themselves and in moments of clarity to receive the words of Hashem, and even then only experience prophecy if Hashem so chooses to give them that revelation. Whereas Moshe lives in a permanent state of revelation, and again we see this in this Parsha and in other Parshas, where Moshe says, stand here and turn and I'll ask Hashem what to do. So Moshe can turn to Hashem whenever he wants. Again, because of the same idea, because Moshe is occupying a different realm. This is the Rambam's vision of the difference between Moshe and other Nevi'im. The Rambam in his Nevuah, in his Guide to the Perplexed, and much more briefly in his Mishnah Torah, says actually there's levels of prophets. We shouldn't think of being a prophet as on-off either. There's levels of prophecy also, depending on to what degree the prophets has managed to dull and weaken their sort of instinctive physicality, which is how we humans are, and depending on that, they will. Dependent on that will affect the degree of clarity they have in their prophetic level. And I don't know if any of you, when I spoke to the ladies on Shura's night, I spoke about the difference between Nevi'im and Kesuvim, and we discussed this quite extensively. We touched on this last week, actually, when we spoke about Shimshon a little bit. We spoke about the Ruach Hashem, that Shimshon was a Novi of sorts, but somehow not quite the same as other, at least not on the same level as some other Nevi'im also. And I discussed this also Shura's night when I spoke about the difference between Kesuvim and Nevi'im, according to some. So we have many figures. We have David. Was David a Novi? Shaul, Shlomo, Daniel, Hanani, Mishael, and Azariah. What's the difference between Ruach HaKodesh and Nevuah? So I discussed this with Shura's night in the ladies' share, but in the Lavashe, But for now, the same source, this Rambam in Nevuah, says there's different levels of prophecy, which is affected by the degree to which someone is able to experience clarity and awareness of Hashem. The Rambam elsewhere gives another analogy, not quite about prophecy, but we can use as an analogy for that. And he speaks about a number of individuals. One person is walking along the road and it's daylight, so they can see the scenery clearly. Another person is walking along in the dark and they're stumbling. They don't have any clarity. And a third person, occasionally there's a flash of lightning, and for a few seconds, the whole horizon is lit up. And it's actually amazing how much we can absorb in that moment. Because in that moment, you can see so much, and maybe you can carry on walking for another 10 minutes without stumbling because of that one moment of clarity. You see the horizon, you see everything lit up, and you see the surroundings, and there's great. So some prophets, he says, are in a sense living with flashes of lightning. They don't have a constant clarity of revelation, but they get it occasionally. The other analogy I use, and I can't remember if I said it in this setting, and forgive me if I have, do we speak about the patio doors? Do we ever speak about that? Okay, so just an analogy of this. One way of thinking about this is if you are at night in your lounge or whatever it is, and you have large patio doors, and outside is your garden. Now, if your patio doors are not glass but made of wood, you won't see anything out. If they are made of milky glass, thing, you'll see faint shadows outside. If they're made of glass, but you haven't cleaned them for ages and they're covered with dust and grease, then you'll see quite a warped picture. Okay, so that's one aspect. But there's another aspect also. If it's nighttime and the light is burning bright in the room, what would you see when you look out? Reflection. If it's dark inside, you switch the lights off inside, then what would you see if you look out? You'll be able to see the garden outside. So it's the same with us human beings. We need to make sure our patio windows are kept polished. That's the work on in the Rambam's thinking. That's the work on the clarity of seichel and wisdom that we have. But you also need to turn the lights off inside. If the lights are burning so brightly inside you that you can't see anyone else, then all you will ever see when you look outwards is a reflection of yourself. Even on a middle level, forget prophecy, but even just on a daily level, we're aware of this, unfortunately, sometimes. We sometimes wander through life and we only ever see reflections of ourselves, right? We blunder through life, perhaps hurting people's feelings, unwittingly being insensitive, not really learning from the world and everything it has to offer, not experiencing things, not really hearing people. It's quite hard sometimes in life to hear people, right? It's quite hard to hear what they've got to say, because we're just hearing ourselves, right? Again, we have these experiences in life. You're in the middle of a conversation with someone, it happens to all of us, and someone says triggers a thought in your mind, and your mind begins going to, I've got to do this, and what about that? And we space out, we don't even have any idea what they're saying to us. Or they finish speaking, and it's, oh yeah, that reminds me, and then I launch into my story or my joke or the bit of Torah I want to share, whatever it is. So that is not turning the light off inside the room. And therefore, as we're looking out the glass, forget whether the glass is wood or glass or clean or dirty, we're just seeing a reflection of ourselves. So this is sort of the Rambam's analogy of how he views the world. We live in a physical world, but there's a spiritual world that runs in parallel to it. If we can dim the lights a bit of our engagement with physicality, we'll be able to pick up the dim light that's coming through from the garden of spirituality. And if we achieve that, we will be prophets of sorts. Moshe Rabbeinu has flung the patio doors open, and the lights are completely off. He's Onov Ma'od Mekadam. He's the most modest of all people. So he's got the best receiving equipment, and he's rid himself of any bad midas, and his intellect is angel-like, and therefore he's able to see and visit the garden whenever he wants. He can step out into the garden and experience its delights whenever he wants. So that's the Rambam's analogy of the difference between Moshe and everyone else. And the Rambam paskins this as an ikar, as an article of faith, for obvious reasons, because this is what lends authority to the Nevuah of Moshe above and beyond any other prophet. And this is the precursor for the next ikar, for the 8th principle, which I printed at the bottom of page 3, which is the uniqueness of Torah. And I'm not going to go, in the interest of time, I'm not going to go too much into that aspect as of today. Okay, so this is the ikar of this is the ikar Kunz Rambam. And in this vision, the Rambam has explained why Miriam and Aaron thought Moshe should be like them and should still engage in regular life. Hashem's response, which is, you don't understand, Moshe is different to every other human being. He's the only human in history who has opened the patio doors, who has a complete clarity, who has rid himself of earthly trappings, and therefore he can't live a normal life. According to the Meshech Chochmah, Moshe has risen above free will even, and is angel-like in that manner also, and the reliability of Torah is based on that. And that's again part of the Ikka according to the Meshech Chochmah's understanding. I think we spoke about it on another occasion. And Moshe that's also the introduction of why Hashem says to Miriam and Aaron, Moshe is uniquely modest. He's not just saying he's modest, therefore he's never bragged to you about how unique he is. He's saying his modesty is part of why his prophetic experiences are unique, and therefore he's different to everyone else. This is how the Rambam learns things. Okay. Now, I want to put this discussion on hold for just 5 minutes. Press the pause button on this piece of sort of philosophy that we've learned about the difference between Moshe's Nevuah and regular Nevuah, and then the rest of us. So the rest of us don't see anything out the patio windows. Then the Nevi'im see with greater or lesser clarity through the patio windows, and Moshe sees with complete clarity. In fact, the windows are open, the patio doors are open. I want to put that on hold, and we will get back to that. But I just want to sort of relearn Pshat and Medrash on the story of Miriam. What exactly did Miriam do wrong, and why did she get Saras? So we have a number of clues to answer this, and we're going to learn these sources together. Okay, so the first source I want us to have a look at is, I hope I printed this, is at the top of page 2. Yes, Rashi. Now, Rashi is on next week's Sedra. Of course, we read the Torah in chunky manner, and we have a week between Beha'alesecha and Shlach, but it's one continuation. So Rashi is bothered by what's the link between the Miriam story and the Meraglim story. And Rashi says as follows: Shlach lecha Hashem v'yadaber Hashem al Moshe lemor. This is the beginning of next week's Sedra. Shlach lecha Hashem v'yosu es eretz Canaan. Send spies to tour the lands of Canaan. Says Rashi again in the italics at the top of page 2. Shlach lecha Hashem lo manislecha Parshas Meraglim and Parshas Miriam. Why is this section dealing with spies juxtaposed with the section dealing with Miriam? Answers Rashi, Lefisha Loksa al Iski Dibra. She was punished over matters of slander of Lashon HaRa for speaking against the brothers. These wicked spies, they saw and they didn't learn a lesson, they didn't take rebuke from this. In other words, Rashi says the sin of the spies is linked to the sin of Miriam, in that they saw Miriam being punished for Lashon HaRa. In other words, they saw an example of how no one is immune. The greatest of the great, Miriam is a leader of Klal Yisrael. And maybe I should have said this at the start when we talk about Miriam's sin. And we discussed this at greater length in the previous year when we looked at the story of what she was actually saying. She's no gossiper and slanderer. She cares very profoundly for Moshe. She's very worried about what he's doing, and she sees herself as stepping forward to deal with a real problem. And she's speaking to Aaron HaKohen, who's Oyev Shalom V'Roidev Shalom. He's not Chas v'Shalom, just gossipers, but nonetheless she does sin. She falls into the trap of Lashon HaRa, and she gets the full penalty of Saras, and she has to leave the camp. Even the great Miriam Hanaviyah, she's a prophetess. So the Meraglim should have learned the lesson from that, and they don't, and it also ends up speaking Lashon HaRa about Eretz Yisrael. That's next week's Sedra. Okay, that's Rashi. Have a look at the Rambam, and the Rambam is in on page 5, at the top of page 5. Again, I didn't print the whole Rambam, but this is basically a lengthy passage in the Rambam, in which the Rambam says that, first of all, he said, top of page 4, source 5, source 5, top of page, source 5, top of page 4. The Rambam in Hilchos Saras, he goes through at length, and I'm not going to go through it, different types of Saras and different ways it manifests itself. And then he lays out how Saras comes in stages. The first stage is that the house is afflicted with Saras. If the slanderer and the gossiper doesn't learn their lesson and continues to gossip, then their clothing becomes afflicted with Saras. If they still don't learn their lesson, their bodies become afflicted with Saras, they get sent out to the camp, etc. Then the Rambam says that this is not a natural occurrence. We're now about a third of the way down the Rambam. You can see it in English or the Hebrew. And it's a unique phenomena amongst the Jewish people to warn us against Lashon HaRa, negative speech. And then he says, where does the Torah give us the prohibition of this? And he cites a pasuk in Sefer Devarim, Shomer b'negar tzaras, guard yourself against the evils, the affliction of tzaras. Zocher, remember, that which Hashem did to Miriam on the way. By the way, according to many poskim, this is a mitzvah to remember. In other words, we're very used to which memory mitzvahs are we familiar with? Shabbos. The reason we say Kiddush and Shabbos and Zocher is Yom Shabbos L'Kadshay. What other memory mitzvahs are we familiar with? Amalek, right? Parsha Zocher, right? According to the poskim, and the Mishnah Berurah brings us right at the beginning of Shulchan Aruch, there are sheish zechirus. There's 6 things we need to remember, and this is one of them. Always remember, because the Torah does say this. Remember that which Miriam does. The Rambam doesn't seem to paskin like that. The Rambam doesn't think it's a mitzvah to constantly remember on sort of a conscious level that we have to remind ourselves of the mitzvah. He says it's a mindset. Remember what happened to Miriam. God's against Saras, don't speak Lashon HaRa. That's what the Rambam says here in source 5. Then he carries on, and here let's read this inside. So this is about 10 lines down in Hebrew, and in English it begins. It's like a paragraph where the Torah warns about this, and it says, "Valinians there, and on this matter, who must be the Torah warns, God's against Saras. Remember what God did against Miriam on the way. It says, reflect. What happened? Contemplate what happened to Miriam the prophetess. She spoke against her brother. She is older than him. And God knows I'll be careful. She raised him on her knees. So she's a wonderful older sister who loved and cared for him. The sick she risked her life to save him from the sea, right? She stepped forward when Basia sees her. She doesn't know that Basia is a merciful princess, and she intervenes to save Moshe's life. She didn't badmouth him. She made a mistake. She compared him to other Nevi'im. He didn't even mind about it. He's very modest. So you have every circumstance in the benefit. She didn't try and slander him. The most is she diminished his qualities. She cared for him. She loved him. She saved his life. She risked her life for him. She raised him as a mother. She's speaking because she cares about him, and Moshe doesn't mind. He's not upset or offended in the least. Nonetheless, immediately she's punished Saras. How much more so? Foolish, wicked people, who exaggerate, etc., etc. So Rambam says, if any of us are ever tempted to become gossips, we need to make a kal v'chomer. Kal v'chomer means how much more so. Right? It's called what's it called in a 40, right? Sorry. Okay, whatever the term is, it means learn from the light to the heavy. Learn from the light to the heavy. If Miriam, who had everything going for her, nonetheless was punished, how much more so foolish people are just engaged in gossip because they enjoy tabloid news and gossiping about people. How much more so they will get nanash. Now, this halachic story of Miriam is a very important source for the halachas of Lashon HaRa. And when one learns the halachas of Lashon HaRa, this is a parsha that's oft quoted. For example, we learn that Lashon HaRa is sensitive to the setting. If I said about someone else, they are a prophet as great as Aaron and Miriam, that would be high praise indeed. If I say about Moshe, he's a prophet as great as Aaron and Miriam, that's negative because he's actually greater. So Lashon HaRa is contextualized. In fact, in Lashon HaRa, there's 3 types of Lashon HaRa. There's things which are fundamentally bad, which is Lashon HaRa. There's things which aren't fundamentally bad, but people see as bad and are negative about the person, even though they're not intrinsically bad. So if I say about someone, they are ugly. Now, that shouldn't really be Lashon HaRa, because what's it got to do with the quality and worth of an individual, whether they are pretty or ugly? Who cares? That's something about the individual. And the answer is it's not really fundamentally something about something. But since we pathetic human beings do care about these things, that's Lashon HaRa because we see it and we take it as something negative. And then the third sort of Lashon HaRa is something that's positive, but for the context of the person, a negative talk. Okay, so this is a very important source for Hilchos Lashon HaRa. And now we need to pause and ask ourselves a question. Because if we put these 2 parts of the shir together, we emerge with a clash. And this is why I entitled this really Miriam's sin. Because in the first part of the shir, we spoke theology, philosophy, 13 principles of faith. In the second part of the shir, we're talking about a brother and a sister and talking badly about each other. Which one is Miriam's sin? Is the sin one of theology, that she's not understanding the status of Moshe, or is the sin one of gossip, of Lashon HaRa, of negative talk? Now, if you read the Parsha, page 1 again, if we go back to page 1, it's not entirely clear. both are being said. Hashem elaborates and speaks at length to Miriam and says, don't you understand, Moshe is a different sort of prophet. On the other hand, he does say, why weren't you afraid to speak against my servant Moshe? But is this against the human Moshe? He's a human being, don't speak Lashon HaRa about him. Or is it Avdi Moshe, he's my servant Moshe? Don't you understand you're playing with matters of theological fire? Don't you understand that you're diminishing Moshe's prophecy, which is, according to the Rambam, an HANDOUT, one of the principles of faith? So which one is it? By the way, even in the Midrashic interpretation, which Rashi links Beha'alesecha, the story of Miriam, and the story of the Meraglim, and says they're linked by a common theme of Lashon HaRa, was that the only link we could have made between the two sections? We could have said they're linked to a common theme of heresy, of not recognizing the uniqueness of something. Moshe is unique, Miriam doesn't recognize it. Eretz Yisrael and the Jewish people are unique, and the Meraglim don't recognize it. So we could have come up with another explanation. In fact, I didn't make up that explanation. There are Midrashim that say exactly that. But that's not the Midrash that Rashi chose to share with us. Rashi made the focus on Lashon HaRa. The Rambam made the focus on Lashon HaRa. The same Rambam who elsewhere Mishnah Torah and in his commentaries to Mishnayos and his listing of 13 principles of faith uses our Parsha as a lengthy exposition about the uniqueness of the Nevuah of Moshe, is the same Rambam who in this section over here makes a Kal V'chomer about Hilchos Lashon HaRa. In fact, does the Kal V'chomer even work? Surely you can say a regular gossip, it's not very nice, but they're not talking about Moshe Rabbeinu, Avdi Moshe. They're not talking about the greatest of the prophets. They're not diminishing his prophecy. Miriam is talking about a principle of faith. So how are we meant to link these two dimensions? How do they go together? And finally, is Miriam a heretic? Right? Is she denying one of the 13 principles of faith, which at least the Rambam is of the view that one who doesn't accept these 13 principles of faith is leaving the body of core beliefs which define what it means to be a believing member of Klal Yisrael. So is Miriam slipping up on that? So, sorry.
We don't know exactly what, as the beginning, we don't know exactly what Miriam said, what her wisdom was. We can't really answer the question of whether it's theological or.
Okay, so I deliberately avoided discussing at length what exactly Miriam said. But so let's crunch the maths though of what we know and see what we emerge with. If we go with Rashi's version, they're criticizing Moshe for not living regular family life. The mistake they've made is they don't understand that he's different to other prophets. He can't live regular life. In which case, they're missing really what Hashem goes on to say. But in any version, no matter what exactly Miriam's saying, Hashem's response is the following fact. Moshe is on of Mikol Adam, he's uniquely humble. Moshe's Nevuah is qualitatively different to yours because he can speak to me face to face. He sees me clearly, not through riddles. He sees my image, not maybe an angelic image. So whether everyone agrees or disagrees with the Rambam's exact specification of what these four differences are, clearly Hashem's response is that Moshe is radically a different sort of Navi. So in any way of crunching it, Miriam has stepped over that line.
Nobody actually realized that.
I think that is the answer, but I think it's more of a subtle answer than and it needs a little bit of working out. Okay, so for those online and just to elaborate on that, so this is the problem that we've got over here, right? Surely this is an ikka, one of the principles of faith. Miriam evidently should have realized this because she is speaking Lashon HaRa, so this is knowable in principle, and yet somehow, as you correctly said, she didn't know it and didn't understand this. Okay, so what to make of this? So there is a beautiful essay from Reb Elchonon Wasserman in which he addresses this matter. So just a little bit of brief history. Reb Elchonon Wasserman was a Rosh Yeshiva pre-war in Beha'alesecha. He was a semi-Talmud of Reb Chaim Soloveitchik, Reb Chaim Brisker. He, as I said, ran a yeshiva in Beha'alesecha and tragically was murdered by the Nazis in the war. He was actually in America fundraising. Unfortunately, he had to spend East Europe, was desperately poor just before the war broke out, to go to America to fundraise. And he was advised by that point, it had become clear that the Nazis were qualitatively different to other anti-Semites and like going back to Europe was dangerous. He was offered a position in a yeshiva in America, and a visa arranged for him to be able to stay. He felt that he couldn't do so. He needed to be back with his boys in yeshiva, and he went back to Baranovich, where he was ultimately murdered by the Nazis. We have a record of his final speech to his Bachrim, which is a very important source on the Torah approach to martyrdom and so on. That's not our topic for today. Now, he's primarily famous for being a Rosh Hashiva, and he writes important conceptual works on halacha and the like. But he also has a series of philosophical essays in which he addresses all sorts of issues. He was fiercely anti-Zionist, by the way. He belonged to the camp that was fiercely anti-Zionist, probably the most anti-Zionist of the pre-war Rosh Yeshiva and others. As actually Shabbos, this Shabbos afternoon, I'm going to speak about approaches to Zionism. So I will address this topic of the different approaches of the pre-war, amongst others, the pre-war Gedolim. But as you are aware, there were a range of approaches, including those who were critical of Zionism. But probably the most strong voice, at least in the non-Hasidic world, was that of Reb Elchonon Wasserman. He has very interesting essays on that. Very important thinker on a range of matters. So he has a series of essays on midrashic matters, and he addresses this question here. And he says a relatively simple answer, but I just want to unpick that answer a little bit, and with that we'll sort of conclude. And his answer is as follows. He basically says, Simon's intuition of an answer, he says it is true that this is one of the 13 principles of faith, but when did it become a principle of faith? Here, when Hashem taught it to Miriam and Aaron and the Jewish people. And you see that because this is the very sources which the Rambam quotes as the source of this principle of faith. So it becomes a principle of faith at this point in time. This is where we are taught about Moshe's unique status. And when Miriam spoke against Moshe, it was an act of Lashon HaRa. That was her sin. Had she done it the next day, again, at that point it would have been an act of heresy, but of course she didn't, because she accepted it from Hashem. So on Tuesday, when Miriam spoke, it's Lashon HaRa. Hashem responds by saying, don't you understand the Nevuah of Moshe is qualitatively different? And this becomes a principle of faith. On Wednesday, if someone says the same thing, they are now not just saying Lashon HaRa about Moshe, but also denying one of the 13 principles of faith. So says Reb Elchonon Wasserman. Now, I just want to draw out from what ostensibly, in a sense, is a fairly simple answer, what I think is quite an interesting insight into spiritual pathways. What do we mean by a principle of faith? I've discussed it somewhat at length in my Sunday morning series, but I just want to give the headlines. The Rambam argues that a principle of faith is different to regular matters. When we talk about failures in other areas, so the Torah says, don't eat non-kosher food, and I accidentally eat non-kosher food. So it's a mistaken avera, it's called a shogeig. I need to do teshuvah for my irresponsibility, but it was a mistake. I slip up and I give in to the temptation of jealousy. So this is on some level deliberate. I need to do teshuvah on that. And it's a failing of personal quality. God forbid I slip up even worse and I end up stealing or the worst. Fine. Not fine, terrible, but humans make mistakes. When it comes to the principles of faith, the Rambam's view is that these are the defining features of what we mean by Judaism. And they delineate the outlines or the parameters of what is this Judaism in which we believe. And if I quite innocently and accidentally don't know one of these principles of faith, I am missing a critical and core part of what it means to define Jewish belief, and thus to be an active, engaged member of a faithful Judaism. Let me just try and explain what I mean. There is a story in the Torah about the Mon. There's a story in the Torah about Korach. Let's say I know there's such a story in the Torah, and I don't think it's true. Okay, what am I missing? It's not that this story in and of in itself is a critical defining feature of Judaism. It's my decision to say that the Torah has untruths in it, which is the problem, because that is a defining feature of the Torah. Let's say I happen never to have heard of the story of Korach. I was away that day in school when it was taught. I missed that class. No one ever told me the story of the Mon or the story of Korach. I never heard that story. And someone tells me the story of the Mon, and so I've never heard that. I remember that in year 4, I had flew one day and I missed the class, and maybe that day they taught us. I never heard this. I'm not missing a defining feature of Jewish belief. I just happen not to know a story. Okay, imagine someone tells me one day and says, you know that Judaism believes in one God. I never knew that. I was away that day. I know. I remember in year 2, I was unwell. No one ever told me that. In that case, does one happen to be missing a piece of information? This is the chiddush of the Rambam. This is a defining delineation of what we mean by Judaism. If you happen not to know the story of Korach, you still know what Judaism is. You're just missing a piece of information, maybe a very important piece of information. If you don't know about Shemitah or Shabbos, you're missing a massively important piece of information. But it can happen. There's holes in everyone's Jewish knowledge. But if you're missing the 13 principles of faith, if you happen not to know there's a God, that's not Judaism. It's missing the parameters of Judaism. Now, this causes us to embark on a very important and serious journey. Quick plug, I have online a series where we look at the Thirteen Ikrim of why, not just why is each Ikr true, but why does the Rambam think it's a defining feature of Judaism? In other words, belief in Mashiach, very important, but is it essential to Judaism? What would happen if we had 12 Ikrim? We happen not to believe in Mashiach. What would it change so much? Obviously, belief in God, right? That's quite central. The first Ikr is very important. The Rambam is of the view that if we had a Judaism where we don't think God communicates to human beings, Nevuah, or even a Judaism where we don't know that God communicated uniquely to Moshe Rabbeinu, this is missing a critical delineation of what Judaism is. It's not just happens to be that this is a story I never heard. I never heard about the Mabul. Okay, even this year's time, I happen not to have heard about it. A pity, I'm missing a great chunk of Judaism. There's not the defining feature of what it means to believe in Judaism. So each of the 13 principles of faith, we need to understand not just what they say and why they're true, but also, if we want to fully understand it, why the Rambam sees these as critically outlining what we mean by Judaism, by belief in an ability to connect. And the Rambam is of the view that these 13 principles of faith represent critical pathways along which we can walk towards Hashem. And if we don't have these 13 principles, we lack the pipelines to which we can connect. So these are the essential pipelines of connection. By the way, it's not coincidence that whenever we talk, God is infinite, Hashem is infinite. Hashem is Echad, he's one. But whenever we humans wish to connect to that oneness of Hashem and access that spirituality, it always comes through 13 pipes. For example, the 13 mitzvahs of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Hashem, Kel Rachel Mechanon, right? In other words, when Hashem radiates down on us divine love, which is Olam Chesed Yiboned, this world of kindness and Rachel which we built, there are 13 paths through which it radiates down. When we in turn need to respond by having the receivers of the receptacle to connect back to Hashem, we have 13 principles of faith, the 13 kalim, utensils we need if we are to receive what Hashem is giving us. Torah, when we want to connect to Torah, Torah is Torah Shemichsav, the written Torah is above time and space, it's of infinite quality. We humans need to draw out of it what we can understand. We have 13 hermeneutical principles, right? We say this in Shachas, Rabbi Shmuel, Mishloishes, Midas, 13 principles of drawing out information from Torah, Kal V'chomer, and Gzera Shava, and so on, 13 tools used by Chazal to draw the information from Torah. So there's 13 principles of faith. 13 pipelines through which we need to draw our ability to connect back to Hashem. What Reb Elchonon is arguing over here is that in the process of the 40 years in the desert, not only is Torah taught to us, but there's a creation and a molding of these 13 principles of faith. In other words, until the point that this is said to Miriam, she hasn't excluded herself from the body of Judaism by not being aware of this. And at the point that this is taught to us, this now becomes a new pipe of connection to Hashem. Now, in essence, what I'm saying should be obvious, but it certainly was not obvious to me, and for many years it's something I used to spend a lot of time pondering. When we're learning about the Torah being taught to us, and this should be obvious, we're not just being told mitzvahs, we're being taught, we're being given vehicles of connection to spirituality. And those vehicles of connection take two forms. They take mitzvahs and the realm of halacha, in the thinking of the Rambam, which the more we do, the more we connect to Hashem, and they take 13 concepts of understanding and belief, which are essential in molding our awareness of the framework within which we live. And if one doesn't have that framework, if one's lacking something like that, one's opted out of the framework, and it doesn't mean one's a bad person, but one hasn't got the framework within which Judaism can operate. And in the same way as in the process of Matan Torah, which takes the 40 years of the time in the Nevuah, we're given these 613 mitzvahs as routes to connect to Hashem. We're also given these 13 Ikrei HANDOUT, these 13 principles, developed taught in a process, or at least revealed to the Jewish people in a process over the 40 years. And as they are given, these become pathways of connection. And in the same way as, for example, Pri Matan Torah, they can eat basa b'cholov, milk and meat, and that's not a spiritual rupture of the fabric of what it means to be a member of Klal Yisrael. And when the Torah is given, we have to cease eating milk and meat. At this point in time, what we're learning in the story of Miriam is a revelation of an ikar, a principle of faith, which now delineates what Yiddishkeit is, what Judaism is about. Miriam is not outside the faith because this hasn't yet been taught. But the moment it's been taught, were she to continue in that, I should say this again, this would be stepping out of the framework within which we operate. So to summarize, the Rambam, Rashi, both of the view, Miriam's fate is that of Lashon HaRa. She didn't fully appreciate and recognize Moshe as a person, as a human being, the quality of individual he was. From that we learn, and this is the vehicle through which we are taught, a parameter of theology, a parameter of what we mean by Yiddishkeit, and this story now becomes a building block in the framework within which we operate. Post the story, the Parsha Miriam is now one of Emuna. Pre the story, when Miriam slips, it's a Parsha of Tzaras and Lashon HaRa, as the Rambam and Rashi teach us. So we'll stop there. I found this Reb Elchonon Wasserman very, very interesting and illuminating, and it gives one a different sense of what we mean by the concept of a principle of faith. And the answer is Miriam's Avera. Again, she's a remarkable and great person, is that of a shade of Lashon HaRa. But from this story, we learn insight into what's meant by, but what we mean when we talk about the prophecy of Moshe. And we'll stop there for today. Yeah.
Can I just confirm?
Yes.
Miriam was to, or it was obligatory for her to think that Moshe couldn't do an Avera of that sort, so that was impossible for her.
It seems she should have realized that, or at least should have gone about in some better way clarifying the issue. So when we explored this last year, for example, one suggested she should have spoken to Moshe. Why is she going speaking to Aaron about how Moshe was saying? So in other words, either she should have known that Moshe operated in a different realm, or shouldn't have spoken to Aaron about it, but should have gone and directly consulted Moshe about it. But she ends up speaking badly about Moshe, unwittingly perhaps, but nonetheless engaging in Lashon HaRa, but not engaging in heresy, not engaging in the denial of the faith, because it becomes the faith through the story. This is a defining moment in what we mean by Yiddishkeit as a faith, as a belief system.
I suppose you could say if anybody should know the real nature of Moshe, it's Aaron and Miriam, really, because they were first.
Yes and no. It's interesting. On some level, they're the closest and they should know. And some level, they are joint teachers of Torah. Maybe again, we'll look at this another occasion, but one year we explored in great depth a very interesting comment of Rashi. Rashi says, the Pasuk says, who Moshe Aaron. Right, it speaks about them both being co-messengers, and Rashi says, "Melami," to teach that they were shover, they were shokul. So, in some level, Miriam, Aaron, and Moshe are equals in a certain way, and therefore, perhaps this is why they slip into thinking they understand Moshe better than they really do. Yeah, familiarity, yeah, and some not contemporary, but some lack of awareness of the uniqueness of Moshe. Yeah. Okay, I wish everyone a good evening. Thank you so much. Also to everyone online, thank you so much for joining.
Thank you, Dan Zobin.
Thank you very much. Thank you.